obsession is to play forward as a midfielder. This is what I've always loved because I like to attack and I like to have the ball, in the final third, which is where you win games.
Something strange is happening in Serie A, and most people are missing it completely. Halfway into the 2025/26 season, Como 1907, a newly promoted side led by Cesc Fàbregas, are sitting inside the top 6 with 33 points and a plus 14 goal difference. A club that was in Serie B not long ago is suddenly keeping pace with Italy's elite. They win 11 league games unbeaten, conceding just over half a goal per match during that stretch, one of the best defensive records in the entire league. The only time they truly got exposed was away at Inter, the reigning champions. But here's what makes this different from every other promotion fairy tale you've seen. Como aren't defending deep and hoping for the best. They're dominating possession against established Serie A teams. They rank among the most aggressive pressers in Italy while playing some of the most penetrative football in the league. They've put 5 past opponents away from home. They've shut teams out with the kind of control that leaves opposing managers speechless in press conferences. And when injuries hit, which they have, the system just keeps humming along. At the center of it all, there's a core that's emerged. Nico Paz, with double-digit goal contributions before February, operating between the lines and spaces that force impossible decisions from defenders. A striker in Anastasios Douvikas converting chances with cold efficiency, not through volume but through timing. Wide players like Federa and Strefezza defending like traditional fullbacks, then attacking like proper wingers. And a midfield anchored by Maximo Perrone that shifts shapes without substitutions, keeping opponents constantly guessing and constantly chasing. So here's the question nobody wants to ask out loud. Is this just a great run of form that'll normalize by March? This wasn't supposed to be a European qualification conversation. This was supposed to be a learning season, a developmental job, a quiet beginning. Instead, Como might be showing us what happens when ideas survive pressure, adapt to elite opposition, and keep delivering results even when everyone knows what's coming. And if that trajectory holds, the question stops being, how are they doing this? And becomes, how do we stop this? This is why Como's rise isn't just surprising, it's a blueprint that could change how we think about promoted sides in top leagues. And why, for the traditional powers of Serie A, that should be genuinely worrying. When Cesc Fàbregas accepted the challenge at Como 1907, this was never meant to be a shortcut to the elite. It was the opposite, a slow burn, a test of ideas, a place where reputation alone would never be enough. Como are not a club built on recent glory. Before Fàbregas arrived, survival in Serie A had been a rarity, not an expectation. Their return to the top flight had lasted decades in memory, not seasons. And yet in July 2024, the decision was made to hand the project to a first-time head coach, one with no safety net, no institutional patience, and no guarantee that his ideas would translate from theory to results. The first year mattered more than people realized. In 2024/25, Fabregas didn't chase miracles. He built structure. Como finished 10th, but the position itself was only half the story. It was the first time in over 30 years the club had stayed in Serie A without immediately dropping back down. Stability was achieved, but more importantly, an identity began to form. By the time the 2025/26 season began, Como were no longer playing to stay up, they were playing to control matches. The foundation was clear. Fabregas leaned into a 4-2-3-1, but not as a static shape. It was a living structure defined by flexible pivot movements and constant rotation. In build-up, one midfielder would drop to support the first line, allowing the fullbacks to advance without exposing the center backs. This kept Como stable in possession, and crucially, protected them during early transitions. As play progressed, that double pivot often became a temporary single pivot, with players like Maximo Perrone linking defense to attack. Fullbacks such as Mergim Voivoda pushed higher, while wide players narrowed into the half spaces. The result was numerical superiority in central areas without sacrificing width. This was not sterile possession, it was possession with intent. Once settled in the opposition half, Como attacked vertically. The center forward constantly threatened runs in behind. The number 10 and narrowed wingers attacked inside channels simultaneously, creating layered passing options. In moments, the shape resembled a 4-4-2 or even 4-2-4, with defenders forced deeper and space opening between the lines. Those movements mattered. delivered. In Fabregas' first full season, Como ranked among Serie A's top sides for through balls and progressive passes, a reflection of how often they looked to break lines rather than circulate harmlessly. Out of possession, the philosophy was just as deliberate. Como often fell into a 4-4-2 defensive block, with the number 10 stepping up alongside the striker. The aim was simple: force play wide, set pressing traps, and hunt in pairs. Wingers were not passengers. They were defenders first, attackers second. It was no coincidence that wide players ranked among the team's top defensive duel winners. This approach came with trade-offs. At times, aggressive man-oriented pressing left space behind. Rotations that strengthened attacking numbers occasionally weakened defensive transitions. But those risks were calculated and increasingly refined. What mattered was this: every phase of play was connected. By the start of 2025/26, Como were no longer improvising, they were executing. The ideas had survived their first real test, the players understood the system, and the league began to realize that this wasn't a temporary bounce. This is where the story truly begins, not with hype, but with foundations carefully laid. By the time we hit the halfway point of the 2025/26 Serie A season, you couldn't really call Como 1907 a pleasant surprise anymore. The numbers just wouldn't let you get away with that. 18 league matches in, Como were sitting in the top 6 with 33 points and a goal difference of +14. Only a handful of clubs had conceded fewer goals, and even fewer had managed to pair that kind of defensive control with the amount of possession Como were enjoying week after week. This wasn't some lucky streak built on scrappy 1-0 wins or late drama. This was something you could see coming, game after game. The most telling period was that 11-game unbeaten run. Over those matches, Como didn't just avoid losing. They controlled where the game was played, set the speed, and basically squeezed the life out of their opponents. They were conceding just over 0.6 goals per game during that stretch, while consistently finishing with more of the ball and more shots than whoever they were facing. When the run finally ended, it took a trip to the San Siro and a razor-sharp interside to break them down. Even in that defeat, there was something worth noting. Como still had more possession than most teams would dare to claim against the reigning champions. The takeaway wasn't that the system had failed, it was that they'd found the ceiling against truly elite opposition, and that's a very different thing. The statistics started to tell a specific story across 3 key areas. First, their defending wasn't passive at all. Como were among Serie A's top teams for PPDA, which basically measures how aggressively you press high up the pitch. But they were near the bottom for interceptions. That combination tells you something precise. This is a team that goes hunting for the ball rather than waiting for mistakes. They don't sit back and hope you mess up. They make you mess up. Second, they were dominating territory and how they moved the ball forward. They ranked near the top of the league for progressive passes and through balls, continuing what they'd started building the season before. This wasn't a possession team just passing it around safely in their own half. They were constantly breaking through lines, especially through the middle of the pitch. Third, they were absolutely suffocating opponents' chances. Teams averaged some of the lowest shot totals in the league when they played Como. Most games followed the same script. Como took early control, kept the pressure on, scored a goal that tilted everything, and then spent long stretches where the other team simply couldn't get near their box cleanly. At the center of all this efficiency was a core group of players whose roles had become crystal clear. Nico Paz became the system's focal point in a way that was hard to ignore. By mid-season, he already had 6 goals and 6 assists in the league, double-digit contributions before we'd even reached February, and this was from a position that demanded he work defensively too. What made Paz so difficult to deal with wasn't just the numbers, it was where he was getting the ball. Playing as a tucked-in winger or advanced midfielder, he kept finding space between the lines, forcing center backs and defensive midfielders into impossible choices. Step out to close him down and space opens up behind you. Hold your position and Paz turns and faces your goal with time on the ball. He was also one of Como's most active pressers up front, regularly jumping alongside the striker to start the press. Very few players in the league were combining that kind of attacking output with that much defensive work. The goals themselves were spread around rather than relying on one person. Anastasios Davikas led the line with 6 league goals, but his value went way beyond just scoring. His constant vertical movement dragged dragged defensive lines deeper, created space for others to run into, and when chances did fall to him, he finished them efficiently. Como weren't asking their number 9 to take shot after shot. They were asking him to be in the right place at the right time. Behind him, late runs from midfield and the wings added an element of unpredictability. Players like Jaden Adai chipped in with important goals despite limited playing time, which just reinforced that this was a collective scoring system, not a one-man show. The stability came from players like Maximo Perrone, who could operate as part of a double pivot or as the lone connector in midfield, allowing Como to shift their structure without making substitutions. Perrone added some goals and assists himself, but his real value was in controlling the tempo, knowing exactly when to push the ball forward quickly and when to slow things down to reset the team's shape. Defensively, the fullbacks were crucial. Mergen Vojvoda provided width going forward and aggression when defending, often acting as the trigger for pressing traps out wide. On the other side, Como's asymmetric buildup meant one fullback pushed high while the other held back, giving the team balance without making them predictable. What separated Como from the usual overachieving story was how consistent they were in different game situations. They won when they were ahead. They stayed composed when it was level. They didn't fall apart after conceding first. The structure just absorbed whatever happened and kept going. By January, the evidence was everywhere you looked. Top 6 position, one of the strongest defensive records in Serie A, elite pressing numbers, multiple players contributing goals, tactical flexibility that never lost sight of their identity. At that point, you had to actively try to ignore what Como were doing. This wasn't just a good half season. This was proof that their ideas could survive real pressure, adapt to whatever opposition threw at them, and keep delivering results. By now, every coaching staff in Serie A knows exactly what Como 1907 are trying to do. They've watched the film, they know the base shape, the rotations, the pressing triggers, and yet week after week, opponents still can't quite get a grip on games against them. The reason isn't that Como are keeping secrets, it's that they've built something structurally ambiguous, something that makes you second guess yourself constantly. Most teams can prepare to defend against a system. Como make you defend against decisions instead. Take their build-up play. Sometimes Como set up in a clear back four with 2 pivots sitting in front, offering short passing options. Other times, a midfielder drops between the center backs, the fullbacks push way up, and suddenly you're looking at a back 3. The killer is that these movements aren't predictable. They're reactive to what you're doing. Press them high too early, and they'll play through your first line using that spare midfielder. Sit off and give them space, and Como will advance their fullbacks and squeeze the pitch until your defensive block has nowhere to go but inward. This constant back and forth means opponents rarely press with real conviction, and half pressing against Como is basically suicide because you're opening up central lanes without actually disrupting anything they want to do. One of the trickiest things to defend is how Como occupy those inside channels without clogging them up. Players like Nico Paz don't just stand between the lines waiting for the ball. They drift. They show up late. They swap positions with the number 10 and the winger on their side. That movement means defenders can never really lock on to anyone. There's no clear reference point. When opponents try to fix this by narrowing their midfield, Como just push their pivots higher, which pins the defensive block back and creates shooting opportunities at the edge of the box. This is why Como keep generating chances from cutbacks and second phase attacks, not just crosses or long balls over the top. It's also why they don't need to take a million shots to score. The chances they get are clean. When they're defending, Como's pressing tells an interesting story. They rank among the most aggressive sides in Serie A for how quickly they engage and how intensely they challenge for the ball, yet they're near the bottom for interceptions. That's not an accident. Como don't sit in passing lanes hoping to nick the ball. They hunt the player who's about to receive it. That man-oriented aggression forces hurried touches, awkward body positions, and panicked decisions. Opponents often manage to escape the first press, but they rarely escape cleanly. The result's pretty predictable. Second balls drop to Como midfielders who are already facing the right way. They win the territory back immediately. The pressure starts all over again. This is why so many teams finish matches against Como with decent possession stats, but very few clean entries into the final third. The 4-4-2 defensive shape becomes especially dangerous near the touchline. Once Como force the ball wide, they collapse on it aggressively. The near side winger presses forward, the fullback steps up high, and the far side winger tucks in to protect the middle. In those moments, the pitch feels like it's tilting. Opponents get boxed in with limited passing angles, usually forced into risky forward passes or hopeful balls down the line. When the turnover happens, Como are already positioned to break through the middle with numbers. This is where players like Aliou Fadera Herrera and Gabriel Strefezza become crucial, not for what they do with the ball, but for their defensive work rate and timing. Their effort allows Como to press high without leaving the backline exposed. Maybe the most underrated part of Como's rise is how calmly they handle different game situations. When they're winning, they don't drop into a low block and invite pressure. They keep pressing selectively, making opponents uncomfortable rather than letting them build momentum. When it's level, they resist the temptation to chase the game recklessly. When they're behind, they become more direct without abandoning their structure. This balance explains why Como haven't dropped many points from winning positions and why conceding first hasn't triggered collapses. The system just absorbs the emotional swings. Coaches have tried everything by now. They've man-marked paths. They've used mid-blocks instead of high presses. They've matched Como's shape with back threes. None of it works consistently because Como's strength isn't in any single phase of play. It's in how smoothly they move between all of them. The build-up feeds the press feeds territorial control. Territory feeds chances, and the chances get spread across the entire team. That loop is incredibly hard to break unless you execute perfectly in every phase. Most teams simply don't have that kind of margin for error. At this point in the season, the pattern is obvious. Como aren't exploiting weaknesses, they're creating dilemmas. And in Serie A, where tactical discipline is high, but the athletic margins between teams are thin, that difference is everything. At this point, the question around Como 1907 isn't whether they're good anymore. It's how far this can actually go under Cesc Fàbregas, and what gives out first if it keeps going. Because when you look at where this is headed, the implications for Serie A are genuinely uncomfortable. Como's position isn't built on shaky foundations. Their points total isn't inflated by lucky late winners or some unsustainable finishing streak. Their defensive record is backed up by pressing, data, and territorial dominance. Their goals are coming from all over the pitch, not from one player having the season of their life. That matters when you're talking about staying power. Teams chasing European spots often fade because they're operating on razor-thin margins. Como's margins are built into the system itself. Even if individual performances dip, the structure keeps generating territory, pressure, and chances. That's what separates teams that finish strong from teams that collapse in the run-in. If this becomes a European qualification season, it'll come down to a few key players continuing their trajectory. Nico Paz is the obvious one. He's already hit double-digit goal contributions. The next step isn't doing more. It's being decisive in the big matches against top 8 opponents. He's already the player opponents build entire game plans around. Very few players his age can handle that kind of attention while still putting in the defensive work he does. In midfield, Maximo Perroni represents control. His ability to play as part of a double pivot or as the lone connector is what lets Como change their shape without making substitutions. As fixtures pile up, that versatility becomes absolutely crucial. He's the kind of player whose importance you only really notice when he's not there. Up front, the collective approach is still the key. Anastasios Douvikas doesn't need to score 15 goals. He needs to keep pinning center backs, creating depth, and finishing efficiently when chances come. If that continues, goals will keep arriving from everywhere else. None of this comes without risk, though. The aggressive pressing demands physical freshness. A congested schedule, injuries in wide positions, or fatigue in central midfield could expose the spaces Como deliberately leave during build-up. Against elite transition teams, those moments can be punished. Inter already showed that. There's also the psychological shift. Being the surprise is easy. Being the hunted is different. If Como enter the final stretch with European qualification genuinely on the line, the pressure changes completely. Games get tighter, margins shrink. That's where coaching clarity matters most. Still, the most revealing sign isn't tactical. It's behavioral. Como don't play like a team hoping to just make it through the season. They play like they expect to be here, competing at this level. Their tempo doesn't drop when they're ahead. Their structure doesn't fall apart when they're behind. Their substitutions tend to maintain their identity rather than desperately chase goals. That's managerial confidence flowing through an entire squad. And that brings us to the uncomfortable truth. This was supposed to be a learning experience, a developmental job, a quiet beginning. Instead, Cesc Fàbregas has built one of the most structurally sound teams in Serie A at a club that historically just fights to survive. If this trajectory holds, Como aren't just ahead of schedule, they're ahead of expectation, ahead of their reputation, and possibly ahead of the league's ability to handle them. Because once teams stop asking, how are they doing this? And start asking, how do we stop this? It's usually already too late.